Here's why Hogwarts Legacy is a great game. You see, I could tell you about all the good things about it and a lot of the cons about it, but let me tell you first, I think that the thing that excited me and the kind of thing I envisioned when it came to a game based off Harry Potter was I should have known not exactly the same thing as what gets created by Portkey Games with this game. You see, one thing I always liked about Harry Potter as somebody, I guess, who was a mediocre fan of it, is the fact that there's the books, but it's never really been about just the books, and I think even a lot of Harry Potter fans don't really realize that a lot of their fandom and a lot of the way they think of the series probably comes from the style and the influence of the filmmakers and the games that were made of it as well. For example, I can name you countless things about how much I like about some of the older Harry Potter games, but for example, you get the first few Harry Potter movies that were very imaginative in their own ways, and you get the games that were also very inventive in their own ways based off the books with their own different ideas and their own different aesthetics and music and all that. I really feel like Hogwarts Legacy did a very good effort of mixing together some things, like some music from the movies, some ideas from the games from the past a little bit, and at the same time overall doing an open world Harry Potter, which was, not easy. Especially not easy, to have a compelling story without Harry Potter himself. The claim that you can make, some sort of like Elden Ring style game in the Harry Potter world, I feel, is a little more difficult because Harry Potter is, one of those things which you call demi-fantasy or whatever you call it, where it's not exactly full-on fantasy. But nonetheless, it's something that people enjoy wanting to see more of, and it works. A part of me wished that I could jump around spongified carpets and jump around staircases in this game, and that's not exactly the case, but at the same time, I get that that's not exactly what ever represented Harry Potter just because that's what I know of. But it's interesting to think about the things about something like Harry Potter that make me like it. For example, I realized one thing about the Harry Potter movies that left a big impression on me when I was a kid watching the first few was the food. For example, in the Great Hall, the food is very noticeable.
Will you stop eating?
In Prisoner of Azkaban, when they show Hogsmeade, not only is there this nice sort of snowy scenery to it, no Shenmue reference intended, but there's a lot of candy. And if you think about it, even though it's a magical world, a lot of these things, when you pick them out individually, are actually attainable in real life. It's just that magic is sort of putting it all together. I mean, for God's sakes, I even made butterbeer myself, and I thought it was terrible. Although for the record, I was following the actual butterbeer recipe from the 1500s. A lot of people make the argument that butterbeer in Harry Potter was implied to be an alcoholic drink all along. Technically, there is official butterbeer products now that are just like butterscotch or something, but I'm not sure if that was actually what J.K. Rowling meant. But my point is, even though Hogwarts Legacy, in my personal mind, does not necessarily represent what I think of when I think of Harry Potter based on the way I was raised with it and what I think of, it's one more example of more developers being just like the movie makers and older game makers, having their own take on it. In fact, from what I understand, Portkey Games had already made some iOS and Android apps of Harry Potter with the same idea, just with a smaller world. So I think that Hogwarts Legacy should very much be considered a great game, and very much be considered its own, just like its own movie. In fact, some of the Harry Potter movies I don't like as much. I feel like particularly David Yates' ones, while they are dramatic in ways that really serve it the right way at the end of the last movie, I feel like the part about Hogwarts in his movies is more than dull. Everything's grayer, and it's a little too serious even at moments where it's not appropriate, and something about just every scene when it comes to the bathrooms or the halls just isn't as interesting to the point where it just takes away from Harry Potter too much. Not to say that makes them worse movies, it's just that they serve such a different purpose to the point where it's kind of dissociative. At the same time though, things like the Harry Potter movies and the games, I think part of the point is that different directors have their own visions of how to do it. For example, I think the Goblet of Fire movie was really good in terms of finally making that transition from a kid's story to a darker story, and the director really understood that. Even though that movie has a very different vibe to it than the first three, it still has very much a rich vibe to it with a lot of different ideas, and it wasn't easy to put such a big book into one movie like that. In fact, technically, the movie does still take out a lot of details from the book. I mean, for God's sake, Snape only appears in like one scene in it, but still. And Prisoner of Azkaban movie also did that growing up job, where you finally start to see them grow up a little bit. Hermione getting into puberty and all that. That's why she's so emotional when she punches Malfoy. A Hogwarts Legacy is the same thing. It accomplishes that, arguably even greater. First of all, while this game I don't think was meant to necessarily be known for its graphics, I think particularly when it comes to the facial detail, they did a particularly great job, not just with your own character options, but when it comes to like every character. Like something about the faces in it are just more detailed in terms of like the skin in particular. I think it's because a lot of the characters have freckles and more testosterone in their face and stuff that just makes it look a little more realistic, where they weren't just thinking in terms of how to make the characters look attractive, but how to just make them look real. But don't worry, you don't have to wear freckles in the game. Not to mention, it seems like in this game, it seems to me like they particularly were interested in making a lot of the different teachers and characters all over the map cover a lot of different races and cultures, which again just shows how in-depth they were going with it. Even with things like hair, which are very difficult to get right in games, they did an excellent job. Or fire. I feel like one thing that I feel is a little bit off about this game is the pacing of the classes, of how I guess I don't really feel like I'm a student taking classes every day and taking very long ones. But I think that that would be very difficult to achieve, just because if it was satisfying my desires of having longer classes, that would probably take away from the actual flow of the game. But for the record, I think that in terms of the main quest and the side quests, I have just wanted to do all of them in this game. And it does a good job of letting you know what quests you're currently able to do. I like how also that while there are spells that you can set, not only does it let you have multiple sort of 4-button spell sets so you can switch off quickly, kind of like in the GameCube game of Harry Potter, by the way, but there are certain spells like Alohomora or Revelio, which is kind of like Informis from the Game Boy Color games, where if it's a simple spell like that, if the game understands that it wouldn't have been a good idea to put it on the wheel, but instead just makes it a D-pad key or something. The Hogwarts map is way bigger than I even thought. You can fly over the whole place with your broom. You can get upgrades with your broom. You can choose your broom. There's also realism in the choice, how the broom isn't quite as fast as, say, a Nimbus 2000 or a Firebolt because of how it was the late 1800s. It's pretty amazing, and I haven't even gotten to the point where you can fly on like a hippogriff or a thestral. Another thing I like about the game, and I haven't gotten too far in the story yet, but one thing that's interesting is that it seems to me like they deliberately wanted to show how different teachers in different houses could have different kinds of roles than they were in Harry Potter. For example, they knew that Dumbledore was of course such a beloved character as the headmaster in the original story, but in this case, it's Phineas Nigellus Black, who was in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows explained to be a very racist and terrible person. And I find that idea to be very interesting, and the idea that there could possibly be conflict with the headmaster is a very cool idea. Also, something like Argus Filch being the caretaker, where he's this nasty asshole who no one likes. Well, in this game, the caretaker is sort of quirky, but he's also more nice and funny and more friendly to the people. Or you get something like Potions class, where the teacher is kind of tough, the way Professor Snape was, but he's tough in a more likable way, where he's just a little bit more authentic with people. Another thing I noticed too is that they make sure to give certain side characters roles within every different house. For example, there's a Gryffindor student who's sort of a troublemaker and likes creating crazy potions and pissing off the teacher there. There's a Ravenclaw who likes sort of pissing off the flying teacher by just flying on his broom passionately, and you know, the idea is there's these sort of overly passionate students that get into trouble out of their passion. Or there's a bitchy Slytherin who goes on about how she thinks she's better than everybody at flying, and at the same time, it's not like they're trying to make the Slytherins look like they're terrible either. There's a good side character, I forget his name, who has this whole side story, and you become friends with him, who's on Slytherin, where you originally meet him in the dueling club, or no, you originally meet him in Defense Against the Dark Arts. There's a Hufflepuff who's interested in care of magical creatures, or Beasts class as they call it. And just like Beast's class, this game is Beast. This game is great. One thing that seemed to be advertised a lot with this game was the fighting.
Oh, the first thing when I saw the movie, the first thing I said at the theater, I interrupted the whole group. I said, "Where's the fighting?"
Now, I like the fighting. However, I'm just saying I wouldn't necessarily consider the fighting to be something that I think of as one of the most important elements. It's interesting too how the story has so much to do with goblins having an uprising. Let me tell you, even though the goblins were always kind of nasty people in the series, the goblins were honestly probably my favorite creature in the Harry Potter world. And that's not necessarily making the claim that they were ever likable, good people, but I just find the idea that goblins are such, I guess, kind of like objective, emotionless thinkers, and they think and they have their own little society and intuitive way of thinking that humans don't understand, to be pretty fascinating and very You know, I feel like if I was a goblin, at least like there wouldn't be many lies or confusion with the way our world works.
Goblins are real.
Like, for example, one element of the last story of Harry Potter is how Godric Gryffindor's sword was created by a goblin, and even though it was created for Godric Gryffindor, the goblins never considered it Godric Gryffindor's because they consider anything crafted by them to be their own. It's those kind of morals that are kind of interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of separation has to do with their little uprising. And boy, I would be so frightened if I was actually trapped in a vault below Gringotts, which actually happens to you at the beginning of this game, although it is cool to be on the roller coaster. I wish this game was in VR. But yeah, I could go on about other details of this game, but either way, I think I've said the main things. Overall, I'm not giving it a rating, I don't do that. I do not judge. But for the record, this game is great. Greater than great. It's the greatest, wizard.